In this session, we will introduce form validations and how we can define them. We will start by introducing the built-in validations in OutSystems and how they work. Then, we will explain how to create our own custom validations. Finally, we will see how validation messages work and how they appear on the screen. Our apps should try to limit user mistakes, especially when they are submitting data that will be saved to the database. However, these mistakes are inevitable, and an user may submit invalid information. Input fields can have different data types, depend on other inputs, or require business-specific validations. OutSystems provides some mechanisms that help us implement input validations and define some business rules. Input validations are specifically important when we need to manipulate data coming from the users. Built-in validations for the input widgets are performed automatically and don't require additional logic. There are two types of built-in validations. Mandatory input fields must be filled, and the values submitted to the input fields must comply with the expected data types. Each input field has two properties, input type and mandatory, as we can see on the due date input field. The input type property should have the same data type of the variable bound to the widget, so the value submitted to that input field must comply with that data type. The mandatory property defines if the input field is mandatory or not. When we have a form with multiple input fields, alongside a button or link that we can click to submit our data to the database, it is quite easy to set the built-in validations. The button or link has a property, called built-in validations, that we can set to yes or no, like we can see in the example. By setting the property to yes, OutSystems will perform the built-in validations. Besides the built-in validations, we can define custom validations for the input fields. These custom validations should be implemented directly in the screen action flow that will manipulate the data submitted in the input fields. To implement a custom validation on an input field, there are two properties on each input that are extremely helpful. The valid and validation message. The first determines if the input has valid data or not, while the second defines the validation message that appears on the screen when the input is not valid and the user focus on it. Custom validations can be implemented with an if. That if has a condition that verifies if the input field has a valid value. If it doesn't, then the flow branches to an assign where the valid property of the input field should be set to false, and a validation message should be defined. The validation message should be clear enough to explain to the user why the input is not valid, and how to fix the error. Besides the inputs, the form also has a valid property. This property should be checked right after the last custom validation. The valid property of the form is automatically set to false, when at least one input field of the form is set to not valid. This property cannot be explicitly changed in the logic, and is managed automatically by the platform. This final check is important to make sure that all the validations were successful, and if not, avoid executing the happy path of the flow that will potentially store data in the database. Let's analyze a scenario with two custom validations. We can get to the form valid verification through multiple paths. We can follow a path where the first validation fails, but the second one passes. Or where the first validation passes, while the second one fails, among other alternatives. This way, we make sure that regardless the path followed, if the form is not valid, due to one or more input fields not being valid, the flow ends. If it is valid, the data can be safely used in our logic. Also, this guarantees that if multiple validations fail, the user will see all the inputs that are invalid at once. This verification is also useful when we don't have custom validations. The built-in validations are performed automatically, but that only means that the valid properties of the corresponding input fields are automatically set. It is up to the developer to make sure those automatic validations are leveraged. Similarly to what happened in the custom validations, this final form verification makes sure that we only proceed in the logic if all the input fields are valid. When a screen with a form and input fields is rendered, the runtime valid property of each input is checked. If the valid property of the input is set to true, it means that the data in that input field is valid, so the screen only displays the regular widget. If the valid property is set to no, it displays the regular widget with a specific styling, for instance a red border, and the validation message when the input field has the focus. In this example, we have the due date input appearing with a red border, and the message due date cannot be in the past.